A movement based on nonviolent tactics, based on international law and human rights. Israel doesn't know how to deal. Israel was not designed to deal with such threats. Israel was designed to deal with military threats, with armies, it's the 5th strongest army in the world. They know how to take on any army or combined armies. They don't know what to do with such a nonviolent movement. As one Israeli general said in reference to the struggle in Bil'in against the wall, we don't do Gandhi very well.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. The Struggle is shown on 22 cable stations from Vermont to New York City, on the internet at thestruggle.org, our YouTube channel, Struggle Video Media. On February 7th, Omar Barghouti and a Jewish philosopher named Judith Butler were slated to give a talk at Brooklyn College. The subject, BDS, Boycotts, Divestments, and Sanctions. Israel apologist and Harvard Law professor Alan Dershowitz and a number of Brooklyn politicians and politicians running for New York mayor demanded cancellation of the talk. But the Teachers Federation at that college and the president stood firm. What is BDS? What terrifies the Zionists about it? Why do they fear the words of Omar Barghouti? On February 6, Barghouti spoke at Yale University. Listen to his words and decide for yourself if they're hate speech or a cry for justice.
Before I start my presentation, I want to recognize the Native American nations and tribes whose territory we're standing on today, and to tell them from one dispossessed nation to another, we stand with you in your struggle for justice, dignity, and rights. Ngugi wa Thiong'o, one of Africa's most prominent contemporary writers, wrote in the introduction to his book, Decolonizing the Mind, how imperialism presents the peoples of the earth with the ultimatum: accept theft or death. He says, the biggest weapon wielded and actually daily unleashed by imperialism against the collective defiance is the cultural bomb. The effect of a cultural bomb is to annihilate a people's belief in their names, in their languages, in their environment, in their heritage of struggle, in their unity, in their capacities, and ultimately in themselves. It makes them see their past as one wasteland of non-achievement, and it makes them want to distance themselves from that wasteland. It even plants serious doubts about the moral rightness of struggle. Possibilities of victory are seen as remote, ridiculous dreams. The intended results are despair, despondency, and a collective death wish. This applies to the occupation of Palestine and to the ethnic cleansing that Palestinians had to suffer when Israel was established. And I'll just give an example of this cultural bomb that Israel used against the Palestinians in a way to distance them from their heritage, from their culture, and to lead them to total despair. Thanks to a Jewish Israeli scholar at Ben Gurion University, we know, he did his research on this, that Israel has systematically plundered and destroyed tens of thousands of Palestinian books in the years right after the establishment of the state in 1948. Systematic pillage of Palestinian books and destruction of them. And this scholar said that Israel destroyed the Palestinian books in the framework of its plan to, quote, Judaize the country and cut off its Arab residents from their nation and culture. But this continued. This did not stop there. As far as the first Intifada, which started in 1987, a few months after the Intifada, which was largely a nonviolent, popular type of Palestinian resistance against the occupation, soon after it was launched, Israel shut down all Palestinian universities. Some of them were shut down for 4 consecutive years, like Birzeit University. Then it shut down all Palestinian schools, and then all Palestinian kindergartens. Effectively, education in Palestine, in the occupied territories, was completely criminalized. In fact, the Jerusalem Post, on 19 April 1989, without any sense of irony, reported that the Israeli police had, quote, and listen to this intently, had uncovered a network of illegal classes held by West Bank universities at private high schools in East Jerusalem. In fact, a warning was delivered by the military authorities to the university administrations, all Palestinian university administrations, saying, quote, under no circumstances can you teach in houses or anywhere else. If we find anyone teaching or any students carrying books, we will take appropriate measures against them. And so they did. Why is this important? It's important to forward to the present, to the last number of years, because it's important to see how this dehumanization is at play in Israel's continuing war against the Palestinians. It's not just dispossession of land, it's not just colonizing of the land, it's also an attempt to colonize the mind, which is very important and has always been a very important factor, a key factor in Israel's colonization of the Palestinians. Most recently, I think we're heading towards a very urgent situation. In the last few years, we're seeing an extremely accelerating deterioration in Israel's view of the Palestinians, in racism against them, dehumanization against them, that I'll just cite a few examples, mainly from the Israeli press, actually almost entirely from the Israeli press, just to give you an idea in the last few years what has been happening. So I'll just read the titles and maybe a couple of words to give a sampling in the Israeli media. Haaretz in 2010 reports, leading rabbi encourages IDF soldiers to use Palestinian human shields. Again in 2010, Supreme Court in Israel okays Jewish-only buildings in Jaffa. Jaffa is not in the West Bank. Jaffa is in the state of Israel today. So the Supreme Court is okaying Jewish-only buildings in Jaffa. In the municipality of Petah Tikva, a city close to Tel Aviv, the local authority has announced that it was establishing a special team of youth counselors and psychologists whose job it will be to identify young Jewish women who are dating Arab men and rescue them. In fact, a poll in 2007 found that more than half of Israeli Jews believed intermarriage should be equated with national treason. I.F. Stone, the famous Jewish-American writer who had a lot of forevision, as far back as 1967, right after the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, said that Israel is creating some type of collective schizophrenia among Jewish communities around the world. In the West, they're defending a democratic ideal and defending separation of church and state. And in Israel, they're defending a very racist ideal that prevents even mixed marriages, and that discriminates against non-Jews in every aspect of life. This was in 1967, I.F. Stone. To continue our sampling, very recently, October 30th, 2012, a poll showed that 58% of Israelis believe that apartheid exists, whether partially or fully, but that some aspect of apartheid exists in Israel today. 58%, those are Israelis. A very disturbing phenomenon was revealed also in Haaretz in 2006. The title is Widespread Illegal Experiment Conducted at Meir Hospital. And it said that this experiment was conducted against 60 women, predominantly Palestinians, without their consent, violating medical ethics, violating basic human rights. But as several writers have said, you can't dehumanize the other without it affecting you back. You, in a way, dehumanize yourself as well. Paulo Freire, the famous Brazilian educator, wrote a lot about this phenomenon. So one example of this, we saw the experimentation against Palestinian women. Very recently, this past January, Israel admitted giving contraceptive injections to Ethiopian Jewish immigrant women. While in transit camps in Ethiopia, women, Jewish Ethiopian women, were coerced into taking contraceptions that they were told were inoculations. And they had to take them, otherwise they would not fly them to Israel. The effect of this has been, as reported in the Israeli TV, that in the last 10 years, there was a 50% decline in Ethiopian Jewish birth rate in Israel. 50% decline. very engineered decline in Ethiopian Jewish birth rate. And all the controversy about asylum seekers in Israel, refuge seekers in Israel, you must have heard about that. And so the riots against the immigrants, anyone looking black was attacked in Tel Aviv and major Israeli cities. To make things worse, Eli Yishai, the Interior Ministry in Israel, had this to say: most of those people arriving here are Muslims who think the country doesn't belong to us, the white man. And Eli Yishai, for those who don't know, is not even white. He's a Mizrahi Jew. Shlomi Eldar, a reporter with Channel 10 TV in Israel, reported in Gaza during the last Israeli attack on Gaza. And he said, he's revealing basically his self-censorship. He said, I came into possession of shocking material, the kind of material that sends you to a psychologist. I've never shown it. Children who were shot, piles of bodies of civilians. I came into possession of material about very grim events relating to the idea that Israel was deliberately going crazy. And then he says that he gave a lecture in a Herzliya high school. Herzliya is a middle-class, upper-middle-class suburb of Tel Aviv, or a town near Tel Aviv. He gave a lecture at this high school, and the children who said they came from good homes told me, we have to kill all the Arabs, including the Israeli Arabs, because where do they get off thinking they will get control of the country? Those students' ideal, he says, is to go into the army and kill as many Arabs as possible. When he told students that he preferred looking at Palestinians as human beings, one boy jumped up and said, who do you vote for? Must be the extreme left, no? For calling to treat the Palestinians as human beings. That's it. This all led former Shin Bet chief. Shin Bet is the internal intelligence in Israel. Yuval Diskin, no less, not a lefty, to say the least, said over the past 10 to 15 years, Israel has become more and more racist. All of the studies point to this. This is racism towards Arabs and towards foreigners. This can explain what Israel did in Gaza in 2008, 2009. Not just the ongoing siege, the war on Gaza in 2008 and 2009, where the United Nations Goldstone report said that Israel deliberately committed acts to humiliate and terrorize the civilian population. I'll just give one example of testimonies from soldiers who participated, Israeli soldiers who participated in the war. This was reported in Haaretz, again, the prominent Israeli paper. An honest soldier from an elite army brigade explained why a fellow sharpshooter who deliberately fired at a mother and her 2 children, killing all 3, did not feel too bad about it. He says, after all, as far as he was concerned, he did his job according to the orders he was given. And the atmosphere in general, from what I understood from most of my men, he says, who I talked to, I don't know how to describe it. The lives of Palestinians, let's say, is something very, very less important than the lives of our soldiers. In this atmosphere of accelerating racism, accelerating racial hatred, ethnic cleansing, the ongoing siege of Gaza, and total denial of basic rights, this is the context that the BDS movement is growing in. This is why BDS was launched. The boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement is built around the BDS call that came out from the great majority of Palestinian civil society in 2005. This includes political parties, trade unions, women's unions, refugee networks, NGO networks, and so on. BDS specifically calls for the 3 basic rights of the Palestinian people under international law. It calls for ending the occupation of 1967, including the colonies, the wall, and so on, ending the system of racial discrimination and inequality in Israel, which meets the UN definition of apartheid, and I can get to that in a minute. The third is the right of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes of origin in accordance with UN Resolution 194. Why are we focusing on all these 3 rights? Why not just settle for ending the occupation as a start? Well, let me give you some statistics to understand why. According to 2012 statistics, there are 11.6 million Palestinians, of whom 50% live in exile outside of historic Palestine, that is the State of Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza. 50% of the Palestinians live outside. 12% of the Palestinian people are citizens of the State of Israel. And only 38% live in the occupied West Bank and Gaza, including East Jerusalem. 38%. Of those, of the 38%, more than 40% are refugees. Putting all the refugees together, you end up with 69% of the Palestinian people are refugees. 69%. What does this mean? It means anyone saying that I support Palestinian rights under international law must address basic Palestinian rights, all Palestinian rights under international law, not just the rights of the 38% or most of the 38%. So ending the occupation would not address the basic rights under international law of the entire Palestinian people. So it's basic mathematics, basically, and basic morality. So BDS is calling for all these three rights, and it's calling for a boycott, divestment, and sanctions until those rights are observed. Now, it is modeled after the South African boycott movement, but there are some major differences between the two. In the South African case, the academic and cultural boycott, for example, was a blanket boycott against everyone and everything South African. In the Palestinian academic and cultural boycott campaign, we do not target individuals. We target institutions. And that's a very important difference. We're speaking here at a university. It's very important to explain this difference. One difference is that when you target institutions, you can easily prove their complicity in planning, implementing, justifying, and whitewashing Israeli violations of international law. You target their complicity, basically. You don't need political tests to test who's a good academic and who's a bad academic, because we don't do blacklisting. We don't do political testing of Israeli academics to decide who's good and who's bad. We target the institutions that we can prove are deeply, deeply complicit in violations of our basic rights. Similarly, in the cultural sphere. So that's a major difference that we need to keep in mind. Since the BDS call came out in 2005, and since the BDS movement started growing around the world, including in the United States, we've seen a lot of initiatives in the economic sphere, sports, academic, cultural boycott, in many, many, many areas, divestment, and so on. Churches, Jewish groups, unions, and so on have joined the BDS movement. In the trade union aspect, COSATU, the South African Trade Union Federation, was obviously the first and most effective supporter of BDS, but also the British Trades Union Congress supported some forms of BDS, the Irish, the Scottish, several unions in Italy, in France, and many other places, Canada, Brazil, of course, and so on and so forth. Among artists, I think we've seen the biggest impact in the BDS movement probably came from artists and cultural workers. From Roger Waters of Pink Floyd to Alice Walker to Angela Davis to Judith Butler, Naomi Klein, and on and on and on. And in the music world, from Pixies, Costello, Gil Scott-Heron, Snoop Dogg, Cat Power, and many other artists have stayed away from Israel, have canceled scheduled performances in Israel after being appealed to by the boycott campaign. And I don't mean just the Palestinian boycott campaign, the Palestinian BDS group, the BNC, BDS National Committee, but our partners worldwide, including our Israeli partners. And here I want to discuss our Israeli partners because that's hardly ever mentioned in your media, so-called media. The Coalition of Women for Peace is a very important partner in the BDS movement that has endorsed BDS, and they produce whoprofits.org, a website that documents companies, whether Israeli or international, that violate international law and profit from the occupation. Boycotts from within, hundreds of Israeli activists, predominantly Jewish Israeli activists, feminists, academics, students, LGBT activists, and so on and so forth. ICAD, Israeli Committee Against House Demolition, and many, many other groups. Altogether, they're still small, yes, they're growing, but they've had enough of an impact that Israel had to pass a law in July 2011, an extremely repressive law that drops any mask of democracy, that basically criminalizes advocating for the boycott. Any Israeli advocating for the boycott could be held accountable and made to pay a heavy fine without even proving that his or her advocacy of the boycott has caused any damage. You don't need to prove a correlation between the call for a boycott and the damage caused, but they pay a fine automatically. An extremely repressive law, but as I jokingly said before, this is the first draconian Israeli law that's not racist. It does not discriminate. You can be Jewish Israeli or Palestinian citizen of Israel, you get the heavy fine. This is still being under review by the Supreme Court. It's under appeal. But if it passes, this will be one of the most draconian laws that suppress freedom of expression. I'll discuss a little bit campaigns in the US, and then I'll move to some challenges, and I'll end with that. In the US, there are several very effective campaigns launched, BDS campaigns launched. One of the earliest campaigns was by the anti-war movement Code Pink, which targeted one specific company, Ahava, which manufactures in a settlement in the occupied territories. So just to tell you that BDS is about creativity, context sensitivity, gradualness, and sustainability. Just the fact that people support the three demands in the BDS call, ending the occupation, ending apartheid, and the right of return, does not mean that they have to target every company out there that's violating any of those. There's no way to build a movement with such a broad target. We have to be strategic in picking the targets. That's why we consider the TIA-CREF campaign the most strategic campaign for the BDS movement in the United States. The most strategic, because we're talking about a huge pension fund, about certain companies that are far more sinister than others, and that we can win the battle against. As Rebecca mentioned, we're very optimistic about this campaign because every campus can get involved, health workers can get involved, teachers can get involved, students obviously, and so on. SodaStream, another campaign that was just launched by an interfaith group. SodaStream is a company that manufactures in the occupied territories. Across campuses nationwide, we're seeing many divestment campaigns. Some are part of the TIA-CREF campaign and others are independent of that. But it's very refreshing to see so much divestment initiative going on. Now, one challenge that we always get, especially in the United States, I think it's less effective elsewhere, perhaps in Germany it's still effective, is the anti-Semitism charge that hits anyone who dares to criticize Israeli policies. Those of you who are following the Brooklyn College scary controversy that a Jewish American philosopher called Judith Butler and a Palestinian human rights activist, yours truly, are going to speak about BDS at Brooklyn College. Sacrilege, blasphemy, disaster. One assembly elected official in Brooklyn said this can be a beginning of a second Holocaust. Just imagine the vitriol, imagine the hate speech and the racism involved by such anti-Palestinian speakers. And they are anti-Palestinian speakers, let's be very clear about it. They were opposed by the New York Times editorial board, by Mayor Bloomberg, hardly supporters of Palestinian rights, I must add, who defended the right to academic freedom, that it's okay to debate BDS on campuses. That's what colleges are for. That's what academia is for, to debate, to discuss. And this morning, for some of you who have watched, I had an interview on Democracy Now! With Amy Goodman. And she really tried to get somebody to debate me. One of the assemblymen, one of the congresspeople, one of the politicians who wrote all this nonsense and fabrications, absolute failure. None of them would agree to debate. They all run away from debate because they know they have no argument to stand on. So just very quickly about anti-Semitism, and then I'll move on to end. Let me put it clearly. Anyone who says boycotting Israel is anti-Semitic is making an anti-Semitic statement. Because he or she is basically saying boycotting Israel is equivalent to boycotting the Jews. That all Jews are one monolithic group of people, which makes them not so human, because humanity is diversity. So if you have absolutely no diversity, all Jews are the same and represented by Israel, and Israel speaks for them, and they're collectively responsible for Israel's policies, that's an anti-Semitic statement. Anyone who says all Jews are, regardless what comes after are, is making an anti-Semitic statement. Let's be very clear about that. So those who are equating a boycott of Israel with a boycott of the Jews is making an anti-Semitic statement. The second point to counter this anti-Semitism charge is BDS is entirely based in international law and human rights. We absolutely, categorically, and consistently reject every form of racism, anti-black racism, Islamophobia, and certainly anti-Semitism. That's been an extremely consistent pillar in the movement, our categorical rejection of all forms of racism. Because of all this, and I'm closing here, Israel started to lose international support. A movement based on nonviolent tactics, based on international law and human rights, Israel doesn't know how to deal. Israel was not designed to deal with such threats. Israel was designed to deal with military threats, with armies, it's the 5th strongest army in the world. They know how to take on any army or combined armies. They don't know what to do with such a nonviolent movement. As one Israeli general said in reference to the struggle in Bil'in against the wall, we don't do Gandhi very well. Indeed, we know from experience, they don't do Gandhi very well at all. That's why BDS has spread enough that the British ambassador to Israel, who is a Zionist actually, said there's a growing concern in the UK and the rest of Europe over lack of progress towards peace with the Palestinians, and Israel is now being seen as Goliath against the Palestinians as David. That's Matthew Gold, the British ambassador to Israel. And there's reason to be concerned as far as Israel is concerned and its lobby groups are concerned, because a BBC poll last year, GlobeScan, which polls 22 countries around the world, showed Israel competing with North Korea over the 3rd worst perceived countries in the world. The 3rd worst perceived country in the world, competing with North Korea. And if you look at some of the countries polled, 70%, 74% in Spain viewed Israel negatively, 65% in France, in Germany and Britain 69%, 68%, and so on and so forth. With the exception of the US, Nigeria, and Kenya, the rest of the world view Israel very negatively. Israel knows that, and we know that. The BDS movement takes a lot of credit for that, and so does the extreme right-wing Israeli government. Yes, you have to give credit where credit belongs. We need Dershowitz, Lieberman, and those people. The last point I want to mention, one of our major successes in the movement has been that South Africa's ruling party, the African National Congress, ANC, officially adopted BDS in December of last year, making it the single most significant victory for the BDS movement since it started in 2005. And just before I close, Israel is really concerned that it's not just us saying that its isolation is increasing. They feel it, of course, but now it's President Obama as well. As was leaked by Jeffrey Goldberg, who's pretty close to the White House, Obama said privately, according to Jeffrey Goldberg, that Israel doesn't know what its own best interests are. With each new settlement announcement, in Obama's view, Netanyahu is moving his country down a path toward near total isolation. And Goldberg further paraphrases Obama, saying, if Israel, a small state in an inhospitable region, of course, Arabs, we're always inhospitable. If Israel, a small state in an inhospitable region, becomes more of a pariah, imagine, such language being used by the White House, becomes more of a pariah, one that alienates even the affections of the US, its last steadfast friend, it won't survive. Iran poses a short-term threat to Israel's survival. In closing, Martin Luther King Jr. said, many people fear nothing more terribly than to take a position which stands out sharply and clearly from the prevailing opinion. The tendency of most is to adopt a view that is so ambiguous that it will include everything and so popular that it will include everybody. For the BDS movement to succeed, we need moral courage, and at the very least, we need the profound moral obligation to be respected. That is the obligation to, as Martin Luther King calls it, withdraw your support to an evil system. That's what boycott means, actually, at the very basic level. Withdrawing the support that your tax money is giving to Israel's occupation and apartheid and maintaining its violation of international law. Thank you.
There's more to the story, including a decision by a group of Yale professors to call on their pension fund to stop cooperating with the Israeli occupation. More in future programs. That's our program for today. Thanks for watching. I'm Stanley Heller, and this is The Struggle.